think back about how your understanding of really anything evolves, but in particular about mental health and with parenting and with kids, one of the things that I've noticed is that so many memories and so many experiences that seem so intense at the time tend to get washed away by the next intense experiences of the day. And I often get asked, what did your OCD look like in the context of infant parenting? And I tell people it comes up at kind of silly times and maybe in some atypical ways. And I usually start off with diaper changes, and people go, "Oh, diaper changes." I said, "Well," and they say, "Well, so you didn't want to get poop on your hands?" And so I said, "No, actually, that wasn't the issue." And it was interesting because at the time, when I was doing diaper change, my boys were less than 6 months old. I had started doing some reading about OCD and had read about some very interesting ways that people deal with it. I had read about people wearing surgical gloves when they change diapers. I had heard of people who were flat out refusing to change their kids' diapers. I'd even heard of one guy who would just hold his kid under the bathroom faucet and just wash him every time he had to change a diaper because he couldn't stand making direct contact. And I thought, well, I can't really do any of that. That's not going to work for me. And the interesting thing was that I didn't have any intrusive thoughts, obsessions, compulsions around diaper changes until one day when I believe my boys are about 5 months old, discovering a lot of their grip and discovering that they can flail their limbs around. And so I'm in the middle of changing a diaper and my son reaches down. So I open his diaper. I start cleaning him. He reaches down, somehow grabs the strap from one of the diapers, the little Velcro tie, grips and rips, and whew, there goes the diaper. And he's got poop and pee down his arm, on the ground beside him, up his side, thankfully not on his face, but of course he's got it on his hand. So the first thing I'm doing is pinning his hand down. And that, I always refer to that as, that's the day that I discovered that I had contamination obsessions about my boys getting sick from diaper changes, not just me. And it was one of those situations that was something right out of a movie. You're just going like, there's poop flying everywhere. There's diapers all over the place. You're pulling 50 wipes out. You're wiping and cleaning and wiping and cleaning. And my wife comes down and looks at me and goes, "What is going on?" And I'm going, "Oh, I got it. But I also think I need to go journal for a minute." And so, that was one of those, we'll call it learning about yourself in the moment, trial through poop fire, I guess. But that was one of the more interesting ones.
Well, we're talking with Jason Adams today, author and parent of the book OCDad, Learning to be a Parent with a Mental Health Disorder.
And welcome to the Focused Healthy Family Podcast with Don and Gina. This is podcast number 54.
Before we get into the interview, first a word from our sponsor. Today's podcast is sponsored by Q Sciences. Don and I discovered that the supplements we were taking and giving to our children were not being absorbed properly. I was very excited when I found Q Sciences. I was impressed with the quality of the products and that they provide maximum absorption. They have a variety of products, including a Q Max product, which is a combination of 3 products, including vitamins, minerals, and a probiotic. They also have hemp oil, a vitamin B12 spray, a sleep spray, and kids products. I've really seen a difference in how these products are improving how I feel, improving my mental health, and I'm happy with the quality of these products and how they're helping our whole family. If you'd like to learn more,
simply go to qsciences.focusedhealthyfamily.com. That's the letter Q, sciences.focusedhealthyfamily.com. Or you can find a link on the front page of the focusedhealthyfamily.com website.
And stop throwing your money away on supplements that don't work and use a quality product like Q Sciences.
And we're back. Jason, it's good to talk with you again. I know you came on my our other podcast, The Invisible Wheelchair, but I wanted to. I just enjoyed our conversation then, and your story, and just the whole idea of a dad dealing with some mental health issues and 2 small kids, and I thought it was a good topic to cover under this podcast too. So welcome. we're really glad to have you here.
Oh, I appreciate it a lot. And yeah, it was a fantastic conversation first time around. And yeah, I was thrilled when you reached out again. So yeah, great to talk again.
And in preparation, I listened to both podcasts that Don did with you. I guess the OCD.
Well, you told your story on stories from the OCD side, and then we did an interview talking about the book and just a little more about your life and all kinds of stuff. So.
Having a mental illness as a parent and parenting kids, because I myself suffer from depression, and I've written a lot about that and the impact, dealing with your own mental health and trying to raise your kids and wanting, good mental health and hygiene for them and navigating that journey, which can be very challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an important conversation for sure.
Well, yeah, and just trying to keep your mental health too, that was, I think for me, I could feel myself at times falling down into some depression too, not at the severity you went through it, but and it's a struggle to keep going there.
Oh, it absolutely can be. And there's all kinds of mixed emotions that come with that too, because in one sense, I think through a mental health journey, you develop self-awareness, you maybe develop an understanding of what's going on, but at the same time, I know for me, there's guilt associated with it because you feel guilty about suffering and tending to your own needs when you're supposed to be a stable provider. There's a little bit of confusion as to kind of why now, what's causing this. And then the other thing I even noticed is that it's something as simple as having kids is described as this joyous occasion, joyous phase of your life. And there are times when you're not as happy as you could be, should be, want to be. And that's confusing in and of itself, just trying to process how the reality doesn't match the expectations that you built up over time. So yeah, I definitely understand what you mean.
Well, you can relate to that because I think it was Harrison. When I first was born, you had some trouble not relating or not bonding. I think it was the first one.
Well, it took me a little bit of time. Like people say their child was born and they felt this instant bond. And it took me a little time to get into that groove of mothering and bonding. I don't know. I felt a connection, but I didn't really struggle at that time really with significant depression. It really was much later in the parenting journey. But yeah, all those expectations you mentioned, of what you're supposed to do, what you're supposed to feel, what things are supposed to look like, and kind of the harsh reality of what things are really like.
And the connection piece is interesting because some of the reading that I did around dads in particular was that, and it sounds funny, but I can relate in some ways, is that the bond sometimes takes longer for dads because in many ways, the child isn't as real until they actually are born, right? And again, it sounds strange. It's like, well, what do you mean? You can watch the person getting bigger. You get ultrasounds and you hear heart rates and all that. And it's true. It's very true. But it sinks in a much different way when you actually have like a tiny human in your hands. And I really noticed that as well. And that's one thing that in retrospect, like understanding that it just might take time for that to develop, and that's actually quite a natural thing for a lot of people. That's an important thing to remember as well. And certainly for dads, that's something that I always mention, is that quite a few dads go through that, where the bond builds over time and the attachment builds over time, and sometimes through happy, joyous experiences, and sometimes through just slogging it out together for a little while and kind of becoming closer that way. So yeah.
Oh yeah, the slogging out. I remember with the first one, I used to, when he would have kind of these tantrums, so I would sit him.
He was a toddler. Yeah.
He was a toddler, barely. He was only crawling at the time, but I would sit him across from me, and I would sit and just be telling him, when you're ready, I'm here for you, and he would just sit there and scream and scream. And then eventually still going through but crawl into my lap and then finally hug and quiet down, but I didn't like go over to him and hug him. I just let him come to me with it.
Yeah. Which takes which takes a fair bit of energy and patience
Oh my
on
gosh.
its own to do, and in the comfort of your own home, let alone out in public. And oh yeah, and mental health diagnoses factor into that a ton, right? And that's understanding how all that works was has been my certainly my big focus for the last couple of years, and it's an ongoing process, especially as we enter each new phase. Like my boys are 3 now, and they're just talking away and reasoning away and testing away and all, and it's fun. It's a really fun stage. I'm really, really enjoying it, and I'm doing a lot more conscious work right now, just in terms of analyzing triggers and really making sure that my symptoms and anything to do with my OCD isn't impacting their ability to take risks and explore any more than I normally would as a cautious parent, basically. So yeah, totally. I totally get where you're coming from with that, and working through some of those situations where you just kind of sit there and go like, well, he's screaming. And sometimes, yeah, just sitting there saying kind of like, just let it out, buddy. Okay. That's what we've done a few times as well. And sometimes it works and sometimes it leads to another strategy. So
yeah, we're not always good at being patient all the time, right?
No.
I want to let you kind of tell us more about your story. I know you did this on the Invisible Wheelchair podcast, but since our listeners here might not have heard that, just like to talk about, the onset of your OCD and, how it played in with your parenting.
Sure. So my boys were born in 2019. So I live in Southern Ontario in Canada. I'm a teacher, an author, a musician here. My boys were born in 2019, happy and healthy, and they still are today. So we're very, very lucky and fortunate with that. They were born in July, and we brought them home and got started with them just like anybody else would. But right after that, I experienced a significant decline in mental health and a significant uptick in symptoms, which I now know are obsessive compulsive disorder. At the time, I had never been through a diagnosis process, and I had been to therapy a couple of times before for personal issues aside from that, but nothing to do with a diagnosis and symptoms that I couldn't explain, that I had no clue about. So fast forward to about 2-3 months into being a parent, and I was able to connect with an excellent therapist who listened to me and then just sort of said, here, go home, have a look at this book, come back in a week, and we'll talk more. And the book was Overcoming OCD by Jonathan Abramowitz. And so I thought, wow, that's interesting. I'd heard of OCD, but I didn't know any more about OCD at that point than anybody else would. And so I started doing the reading, and it was kind of a mind-blowing experience. I remember writing in the margins like, oh my God, this is me. Like, I can't believe, like, and I remember kind of going back to him and being like, okay, I get where you're coming from with this. I get the diagnosis. So now let's get to work. So started doing lots of work on my own symptoms and obsessions and compulsions that were related to things that, as I was learning, had really affected me for quite a long time. But I hit a bit of a roadblock when it came to intrusive thoughts and obsessions about my kids and what I could do about those. And to give like a couple examples, I had terrible intrusive thoughts about harm coming to my boys, either through falling from a height or through drowning or from dying in their sleep. And you might think, well, lots of parents have those fears. Of course they do. And I said, yes, that's true. But mine were at the level where I wasn't sleeping. I had to compulsively check their breathing 3 different times in 3 different ways per bedtime. If I didn't, I couldn't go to sleep. I would get really, really uncomfortable and bent out of shape when they were on the slightest height, even at around 18 months old. I'm picturing floors falling through climbers. I wouldn't take them on balconies. And that's really how I explain it to people, is that, like, you think of a typical fear, but sort of on jet fuel, and to the point where it was really impacting the quality of day-to-day life. And what I found was that as I went through these symptoms and as I started to journal them and document them, I started asking around of like, okay, so is there any sort of OCD parenting books. There's lots out there about parenting a child who has OCD, but not necessarily about what to do when you are a parent with OCD. And I kept asking around, has anybody seen a book like this? Has anybody seen materials on this? And it didn't really exist. So I decided to do that myself. Now, I should qualify that by saying I'm not a therapist, I'm not a doctor, but what I did was I took everything I was learning in cognitive behavioral therapy and exposure with response prevention therapy, customized it to sort of a parenting slant, collected all that, and then just put it into a book to share it. So that was about 8 or 9 months ago now that book came out, as you mentioned, and here we are today, and things are going well and much healthier mentally and physically than those early times. And the book has led to lots of great conversations such as this one. So there we go.
And I think it's wonderful that you put that book together. You looked for a resource and couldn't find it. That's kind of how Don and I created our business, Focused Healthy Family, as we saw the gap that existed. And so thank you for sharing your stories and creating that book, because, like you said, I'm sure there are plenty other parents out there with OCD. And, it's affecting their parenting ability in many different ways. And so to have that resource coming, it's one thing to have a book from a professional, like you said, but to know somebody else who's gone through what you're going through, right? There's some a strength and bonding in that.
On the job training, as I call it.
Oh, yeah. Well, and you spoke to the two sort of gaps that I am trying to fill in the literature. Because again, I mean, I'm not a doctor, but what I'm trying to fill is anything to do with parenting and OCD is I think intense on an even higher level, because just for anyone who's listening who hasn't heard of these types of thoughts before, obsessions and compulsions are often what we call ego dystonic thoughts, which means that they take whatever you value, whatever you love the most, and target that. And you end up with a lot of very, very difficult thoughts about the things you value the most. And as a parent, one of the extra complications is that it's a lot more emotionally charged, because it's your kids who are very vulnerable and who you're directly responsible for. And it's sometimes very hard to tell the line between healthy parenting instincts and maladaptive mental health symptoms. And the other thing is that you spoke to it, is that I knew I couldn't possibly be the only one with kids experiencing these kinds of symptoms. There was no way. And OCD affects 2 to 3% of the population that we know of. I've spoken to lots of experts who figure it's quite underdiagnosed, underrecognized. Mm-hmm. So between those two things, helping to navigate a very mentally intense, emotionally intense period in your life, and filling a gap and filling in information that I'm sure lots of people would be looking for. Those were two of the big motivations. And the book for me was a very cathartic sort of, I have a good friend who calls it sort of my 60,000 word CBT exercise of processing all my symptoms. And I mean, admittedly, it certainly helped with that, but it was also everything in the book was made with that intention to fill those two gaps that I just mentioned. So that makes a lot of sense.
I know when I listened to your other interviews you did with Don, you talked about, exposure response therapy, and when it's the fears you have about your kids, that you can't exactly expose them to these fears to overcome it. As an example, right. Our daughter, who first suffered with OCD, had a fear of contamination, anybody who could have touched something involving smoking. And so even a library book. And I remember an exposure, we went to the library, and she just standing outside the library was overwhelming to her, right? And so you expose yourself to that fear. And I know you touched on this, and I'd love to hear more about that. It's just, these fears of your kids falling from heights and drowning, right? How do you expose yourself to those fears to work through it?
One of the things with the smoking factor, what was even tougher about it, I wasn't going to get her to smoke, to face it, but also just the idea of we had to kind of figure out a way to tell them that it's not good for you, but being around it is not. It was just I'm trying
because
to say
it is dangerous, and even secondhand smoke is dangerous, and that was part of her fear, right? But it's taken to this irrational level, right? And so you have to, okay, yes, it is rational to not want to be around people who smoke and to not want to inhale that, yet right. So, how do you
balance that? Yeah.
Balancing that exposure was a challenge for us. And so I'm
curious about what,
your own.
How you
well, like you're learning to differentiate between the presence, like the possibility of harm and the certainty of harm. And that's a textbook OCD symptom, is that the possibility of harm, the possibility of harm feels like a certainty of harm, and kind of only certainty of no harm coming will do, right? And that's one of the reasons why severe OCD makes it very hard for you to function in the world, because there's no situation out there that has 100% guaranteed safety, and your imagination can really wander with that. And so I totally understand the smoking thing, for example, where you're saying like, it's not good for you, but it won't kill you to be around it. How do I explain that? Right? People die from smoking, but people don't usually die from walking past someone who smokes. But again, like you try and explain that to somebody who's locked in that cycle where like the amygdala, the threat center of the brain is just going wild, and that constant threat response is there and it's going unregulated. It's very, very difficult. And the challenge with it, as you mentioned, is that you have to, like with ERP, and again, for anyone who's never tried ERP, exposure response prevention therapy, essentially you find your triggers, what those things that trigger your obsessions, intrusive thoughts and compulsions, and you rank them. You rank them. So if it's to do with heights, for example, you might say standing on a ladder on the third rung is kind of my lowest. That's about like maybe a 10 out of 100. We use a scale called, or at least I used a scale called the Subjective Units of Discomfort Scale, SUDS. So standing on the third rung of a ladder might be a 3. Hiking along a cliff edge might be a 90 to 100, which is just like unbearable. And then you just gradually expose yourself to those discomforts until they become familiar, boring, and then eventually easy. And that takes structure and time and effort. And I remember learning about that and using it really well for some of the obsessions that I had of my own. For example, I had one to do with heights, actually, and I set myself up, it's called an exposure hierarchy. And I finished off with going up to a hiking trail, actually, and standing within a few feet of a cliff edge and just standing there and not thinking about falling, not thinking about somebody else falling, all these different intrusive thoughts. But when it came time to use that for my kids, again, this is where I found myself frustrated, where contamination, for example, as I mentioned in my earlier story, I had severe intrusive thoughts about contamination. So they'd pick up a piece of food that fell on the ground and put it in their mouth. I picture them getting hepatitis A, right? If I had concern that there might have been a piece of a stem or a little piece of mold on something they ate that I hadn't caught, that they were going to die of a fungal infection, all these kinds of things. And so when I read about ERP, I'm going, well, this is no good. I can't gradually expose my boys to stronger and stronger contaminants just to prove that they're not going to die from them. Like that doesn't work. Right. But what I discovered in that case actually is imaginal exposures. And this is one that I tell anybody who will listen. I've actually got an article about it on my blog and my website, which I'll mention later. But imaginal exposures is basically you take whatever scenario you're picturing and you write it out in vivid detail. I always tell people it's best to stick to about like half a page to a page when you're doing that. You don't want to go on for too long, but you write it out and then you put it away for a day or two and then you read it. And then you put it away for a day or two and then you read it again and you read it again until, in my experience, what starts to happen is you start to think about your thoughts rather than just thinking them. So you have the ability to start analyzing them a little bit more rationally. You don't have to hold it in your head and dissect it at the same time. It's on paper and you can spend your mental energy thinking about it. So you start to poke holes in the theory that you've written out a little bit. And then the other thing is that even if the scenario does have some base in reality, so even if you're saying, for example, I pictured my son picking up a piece of rotten shrimp from the floor from a party the night before that I didn't notice, and he puts it in his mouth and throws up or something like that. Well, that's possible. right? I mean, that could happen. But what starts to happen is you don't catastrophize it as much. You start to work through what a more likely outcome would be. And then the other thing is that you start to analyze, and this is branching into cognitive behavioral therapy a little bit, but I found it all just happens with imaginal exposures. You start to ask yourself, okay, what would have to happen for this situation to happen? So if I'm thinking about my son picking up a piece of contaminated food from the floor, what would have to happen? And what is the likelihood of that happening? So I would write out, for example, well, I'd have to leave rotten food on the floor for several days. Well, the chances of that are very low because we clean the floor every day. We have 3-year-olds. We clean all the time. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I'd have to leave him unsupervised long enough for him to find it and eat it. Well, in our house is not huge, and we do give our boys some free time and space, but they're generally pretty supervised. So that's very low probability. Next thing is that if he does pick it up and eat it, what is the likelihood that there's something life-threatening that can't be treated? And that, again, really, now that I can think about this thought rather than just thinking, I'm going, that's a fairly low probability as well. So this is not an imminent doom scenario after all. Now, I'm talking about a process of a couple of weeks to come around to that point, but the magic of it is that scenario no longer triggers me. So a couple of weeks of work of revisiting this every couple of days, and that intrusive thought just lessened in its harm and intensity significantly. Mm-hmm. So like that's one kind of easy, somewhat quick example of how I use ERP as a parent.
I appreciate that. Yeah. Sharing that detail of that, right. And help people to understand, like you're saying, all parents have fears. We all worry about these things happening with our kids.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
But, when it's obsessive compulsive disorder, it's taken to that extreme where I could imagine the challenges. It's challenging enough as a parent worrying about things with your kids to have that invading your time. You talk about that you were able to parent and you functioned and you went to work and all these things, and yet that's dragging down your mind and you're not enjoying,
big time. Yeah. Physical and mental exhaustion are absolutely part of it. And you touched on an important point about, and again, you'd say, well, no parent wants their child to get sick, really, beyond the usual healthy, like you have to get a cold to build an immune system. No parent wants their child to get sick. So in some ways, how is what I'm describing any different than what any other parent goes through? And I often tell people that's actually one of the benefits of ERP is using a SUD scale and completing an exposure hierarchy, because when we look at the difference between clinical chronic OCD symptoms and quote typical, whatever that means, quote typical parenting worries, we start to look at we look at harm. How much harm is it causing? And you can quantify that a little bit. How many hours a day are you spending thinking about it? What are you able to do because of it? What are you not able to do because of it? I actually drafted up my own little assessment tool for that, drawn from lots of expert resources. I've actually got that post on my blog too, which I'll mention later. Okay. But really assessing the extent of harm that those thoughts are causing, that's a really good way to differentiate between a typical parent worry and an obsession. And I always tell people the big difference is that the obsessions don't leave and they cause harm. They affect day-to-day life outside of the scenario that you are obsessing about, and they have collateral harm. So it's not just sort of the physical worry, the emotional worry rather. Maybe it's a loss of physical energy. Maybe it's confusion and anxiety about not having control of your mind. Maybe it's the way you treat your family and you're a little bit more rigid and controlling about certain things that you don't need to be as rigid and controlling about. All those things are ways to tell what's healthy and what's not. So yeah, definitely worth mentioning.
Well, I know with our first daughter that went through it, I can remember I was trying to work, had my own business, and I was consulting with a company that was about 45 minutes to an hour from us. And there was so many times that I left the house with her screaming and not wanting me to go and not wanting me to let me go. And you'd have to pull her back and she'd be like trying to hit you and you're trying to hold the baby. And I remember being in business like that, I felt like my mind was split down the middle. One part of it was left at home, worried about what was going to happen there and if I needed to be there. And the other part trying its best to do some kind of business, trying to do the work. And my productivity was probably at a at its all-time low because I did only had half a brain to work with. I mean, the effects it has on your thinking and your processing and how you treat others because of it is that's very true. I was curious about, because you just gave us a couple of strategies right there for parenting versus just somebody dealing with OCD. What other different strategies did you have to come up with based on parenting with OCD versus parenting a child with OCD?
Right. So there's kind of a top three that I would mention. So one is actually the probability chart that I mentioned earlier. So it's a process of really analyzing a scenario. I was in a therapy group at one point for OCD, and the example we used is the intrusive thought that someone is about to walk into your house and kill you if you don't lock your door. Mm-hmm. So we broke that scenario down. We said, okay, let's look at every factor involved in that scenario coming true. So first of all, there has to be somebody walking down your street who's decided today's the day they're going to kill somebody. What's the likelihood of that happening? Second thing, they have to notice your house and choose your house to come in. Okay, what's the odds of that happening? Third, and you have to be real, like in terms of a percentage, like give me a hard number, right? What really are the odds of that happening? Third thing, you have to assume that you're not going to defend yourself when they come in. And then the fourth thing is that, for example, once they come in and actually start this situation, that they'll actually go through with it. So that's an example we used in group. But then within the context of my own parenting, the contaminated food one was one that I mentioned. I use that a lot for my fears of my boys around heights. So, for example, terrible intrusive thoughts about them falling from balconies and falling from defective climbers. So I would use that probability chart and I would say, okay, what would have to happen for them to fall through a climber? Well, the climber floor would have to give out. The climber would have to fall over. I'd have to leave them unsupervised. I'd have to not intervene when I saw them in a risky situation, all those things basically. And that really helped because again, it took the intrusive thought away from the sort of emotional threat response system and brought it back into that more rational brain where, again, because it was out on paper and I was analyzing it bit by bit, I could think about it instead of just thinking it. And one thing I will emphasize is that writing it out allowed me to go through that process multiple times. And I would tell anybody listening that we had a phrase in my my therapy group of, if you expose yourself to an intrusive thought or a trigger once, it's likely to feel fear-provoking, anxiety-provoking, and uncomfortable. If you expose yourself to it 5 times, it's likely to feel uncomfortable and you're likely want to avoid it. If you expose yourself to it 10 or 15 times, it's going to start getting really boring and eventually you're going to get tired of it and it's going to start to feel easier. So that was one. Absolutely. That's a strategy that I would just, after my boys were in bed, I would journal some of those at my desk. I would talk about them with my my individual therapist and my group therapist. Then occasionally I would share some with my wife as well. We didn't want my therapy to become her responsibility as well. She was busy enough taking care of 2 kids, recovering from a natural childbirth, nursing twins for 14 months. I mean, she had lots to deal with. She had lots. So I always joke with people, I'm like, yeah, that was all really hard on me, wasn't it? Jeez. And she just looks at me with laser eyes when I make that joke, right? But it's but the point is that I would share with her what I was doing with those sometimes, but not to the point where I asked her to do it for me or where we had endless conversations about it. We tried to establish a balance that way. The second one that I used a lot that I thought was really, really helpful was this process. I'm trying to think of what the exact title of the exercise is. I believe it's called the double standard exercise. Okay, so, and again, it's a cognitive behavioral therapy strategy, but and so I'm sure it goes by different names, but I knew it as the double standard exercise. And what that is basically you take a trigger and the obsessions and compulsions that come from it. So going back to the contamination example, you write out the scenario that triggers you very, very explicitly. My son picks up a piece of lunch meat from the kitchen floor, puts it in his mouth, and gets sick. And then what you do is you start to go through any other scenario where your son could have been contaminated by something. And what you start to realize is that so you could write out, for example, we used a public washroom. He touched a toy in a toy store that 100 other kids have probably touched. He helped me open a door. His brother gave him a toy that he had just chewed on and he put it in his mouth. And what you start to realize is that none of those situations triggered intrusive thoughts and obsessions and compulsions. And some people say, well, aren't you just showing people 1,000 other scenarios where they should be worried? And actually, in my experience, that's not the case. And the reason why it's not the case is because as you're writing this out, again, you're thinking about what you're writing and you can see it on paper and you realize, actually, there are tons of other scenarios where I don't worry about this, where I can think rationally about it. This one particular situation is a trigger. So how should I then adjust my reaction to this situation, knowing how I react to this same contamination trigger in lots of other scenarios? And in doing so, you learn this is what a rational, adaptive, properly cautious reaction is. And this is what my maladaptive reaction looks like. And then once you can separate those two, I found that you can start to adjust your response in that situation, basically. So there was that one. And then the last one for me was actually a combination of communicating with my wife and of giving myself a bit of a mental routine. So one of the exercises that I used often asked the question, what do I understand about the way I think? What do I understand about the way I process this? And it teaches you to recognize the physical, mental, and emotional signs of obsessions and compulsions. It teaches you to recognize them and then intervene. So again, what was one for me? Bath times and drowning, for example, was a really big intrusive thought, resulted in a lot of compulsions and a lot of rigidity around bath routines. I identified that as a trigger, and when I felt that trigger come up, I would say, what do I remember about the way I think in these situations? I would say it, usually I would say it mentally. Occasionally I would say it out loud. And I would explain to my wife, I'm having an obsessive thought right now about something bad happening in this situation. I'm working it down. And then I would just kind of continue on. And that was helpful for my wife because she understood what was going on in my head a little bit more. And it was helpful for me because what I found was that the external started affecting the internal. The self-talk, either out loud or internally, really started affecting my physical, mental, and emotional reactions to those triggers. So really those three things, the responsibility chart that I just mentioned, I mentioned imaginal exposures as well, and I would definitely bring that one up again. Right. The double standard, and then that sort of replacement phrase once you've identified certain triggers.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
wonderful.
That's good.
I just wanted to touch on listening to the podcast with Don. You talked about, you wish you had done things a little better, that you wish you had identified, the OCD sooner, talking about trying to cope for too long with it before you went and got help. And when I heard you say that, I just totally related, because it took me a long time to see a professional about my depression. I kept pushing it off. I was still working. I was still, making dinner, doing the basic things around the house. But it was tiring and exhausting, and it took all my effort, and it was taking the joy out of doing those things. And so looking at that, I'm always looking to help other parents, so speaking to other parents out there who might see some of these signs, what would you recommend as the first steps to take, to help identify? Maybe they're not sure. They just know they're bothered by things, and that, they may or not, know what's going on. Is this OCD or not?
Yeah. So the first thing, as just a concept, like I have a few concrete steps as well, but just in terms of a concept, yeah, I do still look back on that time, especially like the first 3 months, as like I wish I had done better. I do, and I'm thankful for my family. My wife, my mother-in-law came to live with us for a couple months during that time, which was a big help with just keeping the house going. And I know that it took me a little while to come around to things. And one of the reasons why, and this is the concept piece, is just rigid thinking. And I always tell people that exact term and they say, well, what do you mean rigid thinking? I said, well, first of all, rigid thinking in terms of what I was supposed to do and who I was supposed to be as a dad, and that it's my job to tough through this. And no, I don't need to look for help with this because this is supposed to be tiring anyway. And I'm set and I'm going to fight through this. I wasn't open to any other possibility. I wasn't open to any vulnerability. And it's tricky at that point because you want to be a stable provider and the needs of your family have gone way up. And it's a very difficult thing to admit that you might need to take some time for yourself as well. And by extension, some money for yourself as well, because let's face it, treatment often isn't free. But that old analogy of like the oxygen mask in the plane and don your mask first before you put yours on before you help somebody else. I think it's a very important analogy to think about here. So that's just one thing that I would encourage any parent listening to think about, is that I'm much better off for having opened up to other possibilities in terms of how I was as a parent, accessing treatment, admitting to vulnerabilities, admitting that something was wrong and owning that. And it's okay to me that I don't feel absolutely stellar about the first 3 months. I mean, look, I didn't leave, we never had any issues in terms of like, huge screaming arguments or abuse or drastic situations like that. And if there are anybody in those situations out there, I mean, just get it again, confront and get help. Like it's okay. But I do look back on that and say like, well, but that's also okay if I look at it as part of a longer journey, and I'm in a much better place now. So if we had to go through that to get to a healthier place, that's okay. But that's what I mean when I say rigid thinking. Now, in terms of steps that parents can take, so there's a couple of things that I always recommend. So number one is do some writing. It could be a voice note on your phone, it could be pen and paper, it could be whatever you can think of, but do some writing about specifically what thoughts you're having that are concerning you, and try to actually quantify the impact that that's having on your life. Again, on my website. So my website is www.theocdad.ca. So THEOCDAD.ca. And on there, you'll see in the blog, there's an assessment tool for maladaptive intrusive thoughts and for assessing how much impact they have on your day-to-day life. Again, I've just drafted it up from resources that I've used. So again, I'm not a doctor. It's something that is really for just self-study more than anything else. It's not for diagnosis or anything like that. But I found that hugely helpful because it really opened my eyes to how often I was thinking about certain things and how much energy I was losing from them. And it taught me the difference between clinical and subclinical symptoms as well, that whole process. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that be open-minded about the different types of resources that are out there. So if you can't afford therapy, for example, if you can't afford individual therapy, there are community groups. Public libraries are a great source of free resources. Certainly the internet is out there. I always encourage people to take the internet cautiously, but also to be open to different types of help. So some people might say, for example, I have a work schedule that won't allow me to go sit down with a therapist. And frankly, I don't want to sit across the room from somebody else and open up about all this. It's like, okay, you don't have to start there. If the logistics are an issue, there's plenty of telehealth services available. You can find lots of those online. And the second thing is that it might just start off by talking to a friend or somebody you really care about to just help you explore your mind a little bit. I do think ultimately, and I'm a bit opinionated about this, but I do think ultimately that a trained, objective perspective is best for treating clinical OCD symptoms.
Right.
And the reason why I think that is, like, one of the things I talk about in my book is that I tried lots of other things. I tried lots of meditation, yoga. I still do exercise a ton, and I couldn't go without exercise from a mental health perspective. But exercise doesn't cure OCD. Exercise is key for helping to manage anxiety and OCD, in my opinion. But a structured therapy program is the only thing I've done that genuinely and permanently lessened my symptoms. So those are the things that I would mention to people. Again, just start studying what's going on in your mind and quantify its impact, even if you're just going to do that informally. Okay. If you suspect you have OCD and you're looking for resources, the book that I mentioned, Overcoming OCD by Jonathan Abramowitz, is a great one. There's a whole bunch of resources on my website as well.
Right.
And then again, take the necessary steps, or talk to somebody to help you become more comfortable with some kind of certified therapist. Because again, therapy, and I always tell people too, it's important to demystify it. It's not some sort of like mystical, magical, like Freudian reading your deepest, darkest thoughts type of process. It's an oversimplification to say that it's similar to a personal trainer, but the concept is the same, where you set goals, you identify your obstacles, and you make a plan. And as I say, like, it can cost time and money, but look at that as an investment. So this is the money I'm spending now. Maybe I'm not going to go on vacation this year, but I am going to fix my mental health in the next year or two. And that's going to allow me to work more in the future. That's going to allow me to be a better parent. That's going to be better for my kids. That's going to help me help other people, right? So short-term, long-term, those are the sort of highlights that I always try and tell people.
Absolutely.
Well, I would add, when just the kind of, when you talked about trained professional, making sure you get somebody that knows ERP, that knows and understands OCD, that's maybe even been through it. On the invisible wheelchair, I actually interviewed a therapist who got OCD and went through all of that herself, and she had to seek help for herself, even though she's a therapist. So I think that that's very important, and and to seek it early. Don't waste time to get finding somebody.
Right. Yeah, you touched on several things there that I wanted to reiterate. That having the qualified person, and that other things can be helpful. Like you said, exercise. I feel the same way about my depression. I was journaling, all these other things, I was doing them, but it wasn't enough. Right. And I needed to have a mental health professional to add that piece in there. And I feel the same way with our kids, despite us learning so much about OCD, especially after our first child. You work with people who suffer with OCD, and yet, we're not trained ERP therapists. And so for our own children, they need to have that therapist, right? They need, and especially to have someone objective. Even if we were a therapist, we need somebody else outside of the family.
Yeah.
That we haven't, we do a lot of work with them and workbooks, and we've utilized some different things as tools.
Well, I think it's the other thing I thought about before was educating your friends and family about what OCD is. That was a big thing. Our friends dissipated from us, because they didn't understand it. They didn't know what we needed or what to do. And so I think it's important to be able, I know our oldest daughter actually went in front of her scout troop and did a talk on OCD later on, not when she was in the worst of it, but educating people.
Yeah, I think I actually did a talk first with them and explaining it to them, and helping them to understand.
At least understand, because like I said, I remember with her at the time, friends didn't call, they didn't, and it would have been nice for them to send a note or to call once in a while, and just to talk. So
absolutely.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking with you. I really appreciate you sharing your own personal adventure, right? There's nothing that is more vulnerable to put yourself out there and what you've been through, but it can be the biggest factor to help other people.
Yeah, inspiration.
Oh, I always appreciate the chance to talk to you guys. And Dawn, it's great to see you again. And Gina, to meet you for the first time, it's been fantastic. And no worries. Like it's something where the vulnerability thing is interesting, because it doesn't feel super vulnerable to me anymore. And you mentioned like telling friends and family members, for example. And that's something where I didn't tell anybody about it. And again, this is something looking back, like maybe would I change it? Like I didn't tell anybody until I was about maybe a year into my therapy journey. And part of it was that like I wanted to know what was going on, and I wanted to be able to come to it from a place of information and from a place of confidence, and to say sort of, here's where I've come so far. Right. And So at this point, like the other thing that I always mention to people is like, listen, it's very easy for me after 2.5 years to sit here and talk about these things that I've done that worked. And, the fact that I don't attend therapy regularly anymore, and I found a dose of medication that works, for example, and all those things are great. But I always tell people too, like, I am not trying to be one of those preachy folks who just says, hey, you can do it, just go for it. It's like I remember the hard work of it, and I can remember sometimes just being like, I hate my brain, I hate the way I think, like it would just and there were, and having a lot of ups and downs that way. But I think that, maybe as a finishing note, what I would say to people as well is that, and again, going back to loosening up on some of that rigid thinking, is that wherever you're at, and whatever program you might need, and however much time and money you might need to spend on it, it doesn't stay that way forever with continued effort. I genuinely believe that. And that's something that's really important to keep in mind. I don't go to therapy as often. I don't spend as much time doing exercises. I don't spend as much money on it as I used to. And I can't deny that these things are work. ERP is work. CBT is work. It takes negotiating with family. It takes hard conversations. But I do genuinely believe that on the other side of those efforts is progress. And that's why it's not vulnerable for me to share anymore, because I guess it still is vulnerable, but I'm very happy to share it because I think that reassurance of progress and possibility is important. So thanks so much for the platform to be able to do that.
Well, thank you.
You're
and
welcome.
again, so that's our podcast for today. We hope you've enjoyed it. We'd love to hear from you. Make sure you leave us a comment. If you like what you heard today, you can learn more about our parenting program or join us for our next workshop by going to focusedhealthyfamily.com or follow us on Facebook at Focused Healthy Family.
And we'll share in the notes the links to Jason's website and his book and other information that he's shared and other resources for OCD.
And remember, how you speak to your children shapes their future.